Geographical explorations are in fact one of the most important offshoots of the Renaissance. Geography is the most important discipline where we find that because of the Renaissance, the important barriers between disciplines and bodies of ideas, they sort of disintegrate.
Inventions of the mariner's compass and improvement in the skills of shipbuilding ushered in the age of exploration in Europe. Explorers needed maps to guide them in their journey. The era of explorations go hand in hand with the era of developing scientific and accurate maps. However, the art and science of cartography and understanding the shape of the earth can be traced to the classical period in ancient Greece. Ptolemy was a Greek scholar living in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD. An astronomer, mathematician, as well as a cartographer, he wrote a treatise called Geographia in 150 AD.
This long and technical book summed up the best available geographical information in the 2nd century AD, that is the time of Ptolemy.
This book was a compilation of what was known about the world's geography in the Roman Empire during his time. He relied mainly on the work of an earlier geographer, Marinos of Tyre, and on gazetteers of the Roman and ancient Persian Empire, but most of his sources beyond the perimeter of the empire were unreliable.
Of course, it was not foolproof, but it had a kind of a sense of geography. It listed 6,000 places, and also it gave a general treatment of European, North African and Asian geography. It was not like the maps which were created or what was called the schematic maps.
He assigned coordinates to all the places and geographic features he knew in a grid that spanned the globe. Latitude was measured from the equator, but Ptolemy preferred to express it as the length of the longest day, 12 hours at the equator and 24 hours at the poles. He put the meridian of zero longitude at the extreme western land he knew, the Canary Islands. His inhabited world spanned 180 degrees of longitude from the Canary Islands in the Atlantic to the middle of China, and about 80 degrees of latitude from the Arctic to the East Indies and deep into Africa.
It described 3 ways of making maps, using different sets of conventions to reproduce on a flat surface the effects of the curvature of a spherical earth. For the first time, we find that it was accepted that the earth was curved, and how to sort of portray a spherical curved earth on a flat paper. It sort of gave a detailed analysis of that.
Ptolemy was well aware that he knew about only a quarter of the globe, and his information did not extend to the Eastern Sea. His maps look inaccurate compared to modern maps because Ptolemy's data was inaccurate. He had grossly underestimated the size of the earth. His values of the latitude were in error by about 2 degrees.
Ptolemy had more to offer than the wrong value for the length of a degree of longitude. He made clear that he felt able to correct his own predecessors, Hipparchus and Marinus, precisely because he had an access to knowledge which his predecessors did not have. And he expected that the map that he drew up or the geography that he wrote, people or his successors would improve on that. And because of that, we find that he left a portfolio of maps at the end so that his successors would add new things to it. Something which did not happen in the beginning.
For the next 1,000 years, Ptolemy's work was relegated to the background and nearly forgotten. In the medieval period, knowledge and maps resided in the hands of religious scribes who supported the idea of a flat earth.
Scholars drew up endless schematic plans of the inhabited world, often as physically attractive, but mostly empirically they were defective. They did not have the correct data, but they were very good to look at, very attractive looking maps.
The earth was drawn as a circle with east or orient to the top and Jerusalem in the center.
Because Jerusalem was so important, here Jesus was crucified. So Jerusalem lay at the center of the world.
The known world was bordered by a cold zone to the north, a hot zone to the south, ocean to the west, and paradise to the east.
What is interesting is this, that beyond this inhabited area, there was an intermediary area which it was believed was inhabited by some supernatural beings. For example, and it was interpreted in this way that they were in fact a warning to the human race that if you sin, you would go to those areas. Or some interpreted it in another way, that because of the extreme climates that prevailed here, the inhabitants were so weird in these areas. And how weird were they? They were envisaged to be people with one leg, and that leg they could sort of use as an umbrella to protect themselves from the heat. There was also the concept that these creatures had their heads below their shoulders, or men with one very prominent eye. I won't say men, but inhabitants, living beings. So it was a very weird kind of inhabitants who lived in the peripheral regions. So that there would be a fear in the minds of the people that if you do something wrong, you will have to live in those peripheral areas and become like those inhabitants.
Maps of this type are known as T in O maps. O is for the circle of the earth. T is formed by the Mediterranean on the vertical arm and the rivers Don and Nile on the horizontal arm. T separates the continents Asia, Europe, and Africa. Each continent is attributed to Noah's 3 sons.
Now, there was another sort of map. They were the schematic map. This one was designed to teach elementary science rather than sacred history. This was something which was of a utilitarian value. It divided the habited world into 2 zones, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere would be divided by a uninhabitable torrid zone, and there would be the 2 frigid zones at the 2 ends of the northern and the southern hemisphere respectively.
Scientific cartography evolved in the Arabic and Chinese world and were used by the navigators.
Navigators also drew maps. They were called the Portolan Charts. They showed the sailor how to plot a course from one seaport to another.
Portolan charts made in the 14th century in Italy and Spain are navigational maps based on realistic descriptions of harbors and coasts.
And you have sharp, detailed renderings of the coastline. They provided the boundaries for the blank landmasses.
These charts showed coastal areas in great detail, but not the inland. They were built on the principles of triangulation using compass bearings from two different locations. Considered as rough maps, these charts were based on accounts of medieval Europeans who sailed the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. The straight lines crisscrossing many Portolan charts represent 32 directions of the mariner's compass from a given point. This is similar to the compass rose displayed in later maps and charts. Naming or demonstrating the 32 points is called boxing the compass.
So you see that there were two sorts of maps for two sets of people. One was the first sort of maps taught a lesson about the moral and the physical order of things. And these people, this was meant for the literate men who would never venture out. And even if they did, they would never use these schematic maps, because then of course they would go nowhere. And then there were the maps which were called the Portolan Charts. They were the maps which were of use to the navigators and the sailors and the various traders.
As travel increased in the 15th century, religiously enforced concepts began to break down.
In the 15th century, the boundaries between these two maps first became blurred and then eventually disintegrated. You have scholars first making the first decisive move. Because early in the 15th century, you find Ptolemy's geography being brought in from the Byzantine Empire.
The dark ages of cartography in the West came to an end with three concurrent events. First, the Voyages of Discovery. Marco Polo traveled to the east by the land route. The Cape of Good Hope was founded in 1488 and Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the world in 1540. Secondly, treasures of Ptolemy's knowledge were rediscovered by Italians traveling to the east.
At much the same time, practical men, above all, men who were actually venturing out to the sea, men who were actually interested in trade and commerce, they began to comb the literature of geography for helpful information and hints of profitable adventures, because they could not be content on keeping these maps to decorate their bookshelves. They had to use these maps for their purposes, that is, to make certain profitable or to undertake certain profitable ventures. As early as the beginning of the 15th century, the Florentine merchant adventurer, whose name was Gorodati, he used both learned and practical sources in his Italian verse handbook on the sphere, which offered its readers, which were actually small boys who would later become merchants, a lucid outline of the traditional cosmology and geography and a very precise description of travel in North Africa. So now, as we said, that the practical and the decorative was merging together, so that maps could actually have a utilitarian aspect to it, not merely to decorate one's bookshelf. In the 14th century, Byzantine scholars had in fact reconstructed maps in two of the modes and added them to the text. The original Latin translation of Ptolemy's geography, around say 1406, it was done by one Jacopo di Angelo, had no maps, because at that time they could not draw the maps. But then in the course of the next 75 years, we find that, illustrators were employed, and then we also have maps in the revised version of Ptolemy's geography. Manuscripts merchants like the Florentine Bisticci sold many elegant copies of these very elaborate maps to the princes and the prelates. These had a kind of a shelf value. If you could display it in your house, it sort of added to your prestige.
In Renaissance Europe, this knowledge spread quickly with the aid of the printing press. Beautifully printed, decorative maps became easily available.
In fact, the reproduced version of Ptolemy's geography, the reproduced and even the revised versions, whether it was manuscript version or the printed version, they became the most important coffee table books of the Italian Renaissance period. It seemed an extraordinarily exciting piece of work, the most rigorous two-dimensional survey of part of the three-dimensional world. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci, when he was drawing his figures, he said that the anatomical drawings were an effort of his to do to the human body what Ptolemy had done to the surface of the earth, or to geography.
In the year 1492, a Genoan living in Madrid, Spain, proposed to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella that since the earth was round, Asia could be reached by traveling westward. It was an era of growing national imperialism and economic competitions between developing nation-states seeking wealth from the establishment of trade routes and colonies. Columbus convinced the Spanish monarchs that traveling westwards, he could reach Asia faster and beat the Italian and Arab merchants in the race who were taking the overland trade routes. Based on Ptolemy's map of the world, Columbus roughly calculated the time to reach Asia. He had severely underestimated the circumference of the earth. In August 1492, 3 small ships set sail from Spain, their bows pointing westwards across the wide, unknown Atlantic. The ships were named Santa Maria, Nina, and Pinta. The exploration was funded by Queen Isabella. Because of the inaccuracy in calculation, the journey took longer than expected. On October 12th, land was sighted. Columbus was convinced that it was an island off the Indian coast. When other islands came into view, he called them the Indies. Later, cartographer Waldisi Muller depicted Columbus's discoveries as part of an independent continent separated from Asia by a vast expanse of ocean.
একদিকে যেমন এই ম্যাপগুলো যেমন জিওগ্রাফিক্যাল ডিসকভারিকে এনকারেজ করছে, আবার অন্যদিকে তুমি আমি জিওগ্রাফিক্যাল ডিসকভারিগুলো যত দিন দিন এগোচ্ছে তত তো আবার ম্যাপেরও তো ম্যাপের কোয়ালিটিরও তো অনেক উন্নতি হচ্ছে.
Where the rendition of the maps are concerned, in the medieval times it was very elaborate and very showy and decorative maps were there. But as times went by, we find that cartography as an important discipline is emerging, and you are actually trying to actually portray in paper what the world is. It is a much more accurate rendition of your spherical earth on paper. For example, Ptolemy believed that the Indian Ocean was closed. But we know that the Portuguese sailors, they, in fact, Bartholomew Dias, they went across the African continent, which is called the Cape of Good Hope, and thereby they proved that the Indian Ocean is not a closed ocean, it is open, as had been proved by Bartholomew Dias' voyage. Now, a revolution thus took place in knowledge of trade and travel. Scholars who knew that Ptolemy or knew from Ptolemy that the acquisition of new data was inevitable calmly added to that knowledge. They used Ptolemy's rigorous cartographical techniques. Cartography is the art of drawing maps. To record the shapes of the new lands, and gradually they showed that the whole ancient system of geography was faulty. The purpose of the Renaissance rendition of maps was not to negate the ancient system of cartography and geography, but once they started the process of improving on Ptolemy's geography, they realized that Ptolemy was incorrect. And thus, what happened was this: there was a reversal of this ancient knowledge of geography and the emergence of a new knowledge of geography. We find that because of this new knowledge, the people realized, the Renaissance men realized, that Jerusalem or any other European city could not be made the center of the world, a world which had more water than land. It was in fact a very watery earth that we have, a very what is called the watery globe. And even the supernatural beings that were a creation of men's imagination, at first these people sort of said that they sighted the cannibals and the Amazons, etc., etc., but soon they realized that this was actually a figment of men's imagination, and it lacked a real perception. It was something which was really faulty. These people did not exist. So there was no actually a border, a margin where you have strange creatures residing. As men's knowledge about their world improved and changed, it was now the belief that some supernatural creatures lived in these margins gave way to other assumptions. They realized that there was no such creatures in this world. Other very important thing that happened was this, that we find that Jose de Acosta, he laughs at the Aristotelian concept that if one goes to the torrid zone, one dies. So when he goes there, he says that I'm hale and hearty. In fact, I'm feeling very cool out here. And there's so many people living in these areas. So not only the ancient concept of geography, but even the medieval concept of geography was undergoing changes because of men's practical experiences and because of the new knowledge that men were gathering, because they were actually going out and revisualizing their world. By the middle of the 16th century, Ptolemy himself had to go. It was realized that Ptolemy is no longer relevant. What the rendition of his cartography or the way he tried to portray the world was actually an incorrect portrayal of geography and the maps. The greatest geographers of the time was, of course, Ortelius and Mercator. Mercator is very important because of the Mercator projection. They drew up new full-scale atlases instead of trying to bring back Ptolemy. The first, when we find people trying to, sort of improve on Ptolemy's work, now there is a process starts whereby Ptolemy is being negated. A new idea of atlases, a new idea of the world emerges because new geographers, new people are coming in. The greatest geographers of the 16th century